welcome to episode 275 of Late Night Linux, recorded on the 25th of March 2024. I'm Joe, and with me are Graham.
Good evening.
Will.
Hello.
And Gary.
Hello.
Yes, as predicted from 5 minutes ago, Phelim is still under the weather, so Gary from Linux After Dark is joining us. Thank you very much, Gary. Voice of the Masses returns for the third time, and I think this is by far the most replied to question on our Mastodon, which is, what's the main reason you use open source software? And my phone was just constantly getting notifications for about 3 days. So thank you everyone who replied. We can't read them all out, and there were definitely some themes there. Danielle said, so that I can improve it. If there's a bug I'm experiencing or a feature I want, I can write that fix or that feature, which was echoed by quite a few people, as I said. And it's not something that I really think about because I don't have any coding skills. But I suppose quite a lot of people who use open source software are capable of contributing to it. I suppose just the thought that I could, in theory, is worthwhile.
Yeah, I think the theory bit is a significant player here. Like, yes, you could if you really wanted to, but do most people? No. But the idea that you could do it, if you had a particular bug or something about the application, the way it worked, really bothered you, if you wanted to, and you were willing to invest a whole lot of effort, you could. And that is valuable to certain people, not saying that everyone's going to go out there and do it, but the ability to be able to do that, the freedom to be able to do that is certainly appealing.
Well, Late Night Owl said, when I was young, it was because it was free. These days, I find myself more and more reading the sources when stuff breaks or changes. A descriptive changelog and patch history goes a long way. And that idea of it being free as in beer, we heard from loads of people. At least that's what got them into it in the first place.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. It was pretty much the same for me. I remember the first time I ever tried a Linux box, or rather a Minix box, was this idea that you could just get this for nothing, that you could have all of this software and it wasn't going to cost you any money. Now, you could argue that in the probably the early 90s, let's say, you could get hold of software for free anyway, just by copying a disk from somebody. But the idea of it being free and legitimately free was somehow more appealing. But I do think that low cost option is what gets most people into it. And that seems to be backed up by the answers we got.
What, you mean I don't have to use a keygen?
Yeah.
That means I miss out on that cool music, apparently. Matthew said, because it's much less likely that the project will just completely disappear or force me into an obnoxious subscription model. And again, so many people talked about how it's not controlled by one company, it's controlled by the community.
Yeah, I think for me, this one really resonated. I've spoken on Linux After Dark how I was absolutely sick of being nickel and dimed by random subscription services, and before you know it, you're spending 3 figures on subscription services a month, which is just ridiculous. And I think along with that, it's this doesn't have to change if I don't want it to. I can keep running the version of the thing that works for me quite happily for years and years. And if I want to pay someone to maintain that old version, I can. And it's just not this ever-changing thing that I'm sort of held to ransom for every month.
Yeah, if I want to use XFCE forever and have it never, ever change, then I have that option as an open source user.
Or an Office suite which broadly mirrors the UX of the best version of Microsoft Office, Office 97.
Wrong.
Oh, yeah?
95 was superior.
No, I'm not that old. Can't remember.
Yeah.
Gary wasn't even born then, I don't think. You were just about, maybe.
Just about.
Patrick says, because I can learn from it, I wouldn't be half the programmer I am today if I wasn't able to look at open source code and get new perspectives on how things can be done. Because of how open the whole stack is, from the applications to the libraries to the tooling, the compiler, the language, I can always peek behind the curtain and learn something new.
That's an interesting point of view, the idea that you can learn from all of this free software out there, that it's there as an educational experience as much as it is a piece of software that does what you need it to. And there's a lot to be said for that. The ability to read how it works, see how the sausage is made, and then take that knowledge forwards to your own project is worth a lot of money.
Or worth not very much money, as we talked about last week.
Yeah, I think it's pretty similar for me as well. Most of the code that I've written, not that I'm much of a developer, is heavily inspired by other code that I've seen on the internet. So I think I probably wouldn't have got half as far as I have in my career without seeing the code other people have written and learning from that, taking inspiration from it and building things myself.
Sean says, because the ideals align with mine, the term open source means something, and there are people out there holding everyone to it. And ECSD said, because it's the socialist model of production for cooperation and service, open means it belongs to all of us, enabling anyone and everyone to contribute and proof it. Life is so much more straightforward when the profit motive is excluded from choosing for us. Now, this is a really interesting one, because this dirty word socialist was thrown out here, and that is how I see it. I see open source as a fundamentally socialist phenomenon. But if you ask Americans, or a lot of Americans who are into open source, they'd see it more as the sort of libertarian side of things.
I don't think it's either. I don't think it's socialist. I think it's just a pragmatic solution, like academic research. If you want to spend time in the very few hours we have on this earth doing something that moves something forwards intellectually in software, I think open source is the only way to do it. Otherwise, you're just reinventing the wheel.
But don't you think this idea that everyone benefits equally is a fundamentally socialist idea?
No, because, personally, I think that there are some aspects in capitalism that moves an idea forwards more effectively and quicker and better for everyone to benefit from.
All right, that's why you're voting Tory. Got it.
No, but I do personally think that. I wouldn't vote Tory, but I think that, capitalism, the competition that capitalism invites in theory could produce better ideas in some aspects than everybody working to this kind of socialist ideal. And that's not to say I don't think the socialist aspect of it isn't important. I really do believe in the community and that we're all in this together. But I think competition really helps as well.
Reform UK, got it.
Don't put fucking flags on my house garden. It's so all you're doing is helping them with these denominations, Joe, and it's just dividing us so that we can't overrun the people who are really running everything, and fuck them.
But have you not noticed the sort of split between, I'm not going to say all Americans and all Europeans, but there does seem to be like a strong American...
No, I haven't. You're just talking about the vocal Americans on YouTube or in podcasts.
Right. You think it's a small minority of Americans who come at this thing from a libertarian point of view?
I think so, and they like to share their opinion.
I like to think you're right, but I worry that you're not.
I think this is the problem that we have with lots of opinions being shared on the internet and the way they become these kind of feedback loops and generate a movement behind something. I've certainly been aware of the libertarian element in open source software for a long time. I've interviewed people who have been very openly libertarian about their usage. I could try and think of a few. There are a few in the interviews that I've done. So it has always been a part of it. I realise that. But not in lots of the people I've spoken to have really made a difference in some of the big projects. I'd say almost universally they haven't been. And maybe they're European.
Maybe. Well, I suppose we'll find out when we get angry emails from Americans. How dare you call it socialist?
As long as we don't bring up gun control, we'll be fine.
Oh, no, you just mentioned it.
This is taking a very dark turn.
Keep it light.
Ozim or Alzim says one word, privacy, or maybe it's privacy. And that is something that a lot of people talked about as well, that because it's open source, there's just this inherent privacy that comes with it.
I don't think that there is anymore. I think that a lot, let's say, of projects on GitHub where you can go and get the source or download a binary have some kind of phone home in them. I'm not saying that that's a good or a bad thing, but I don't think that just because something is open source means that it has inherent privacy built in.
But surely if it's open source, someone can take that stuff out.
Yeah, absolutely. You could, if you wanted to, take it out. But I don't think that they do. I think that the majority of people download a binary, run it happy. It didn't cost me anything, so I don't care.
Yeah, but at least it's possible to know what it's doing. Whereas something like Discord, you install that app, you have literally no idea what it's doing. I don't know why I'm picking on Discord because I just hate it. But, any bit of proprietary software, you've got no clue what it's doing.
Yeah, but how many people, well, maybe our listenership is a bad example, but how many people actually do that? Do you look for a bit of software? Do you search a store? Do you search the deb repository? You find one, you install it. Do you actually bother to look at the code? I don't think so. That said, I imagine that most of the packages in a, for example, Debian repository or even a Red Hat repository probably don't have any kind of phone home stuff in. I think that is probably more GitHub projects than it is core repo projects.
Digital Fox said, because it's far more frustrating being told we decided not to fix your issue, tough luck, than it is being told nobody's interested in fixing that, but you could try it if you learn how.
This is one very close to my motivation as well. I think in the late 90s, I got really fed up investing my time learning how to use something, like investing myself in a product only for that product to change or for them to not fix a bug that is fundamental to the future of it. And we've covered this, but in open source, you have theoretically the power to do that yourself and also the power to help manage the direction that those projects take. And that's really vital for me. Really vital. It's why I choose it over everything else, I think.
Well, another thing that a lot of people said was summed up by what Johnny said. Most of the time, it works better than the alternatives, which I don't think was always true, was it? But more and more, I think he's right. And I think that everyone who said that is right.
I think you're right too. And it's a lot of the things that we've talked about, bug fixing and subscriptions and features going in directions you don't want to take them to, as well as the actual quality of the software itself. Add those things together and it's become a better solution, which is why perhaps it's the standard model for so much development now.
Yeah. And Iron Bug said, among other things, customization of everything. That, I think, is one of the big things for me, that open source software is generally more customizable. I mean, just take Linux. You can have any desktop interface you want on there, whether you want something simple and clean, let's say like GNOME, or even simpler like a tiling window manager, or something really old school like XFCE, or anything in between. You can, to some extent, do that with proprietary operating systems and also proprietary software, but not to the same extent you can with open source. Jonathan said, with FOSS, I can generally assume that things will either stay the same or get better. Every time I have the misfortune of booting a Windows system, Microsoft's bullshit serves as a strong reminder that that's not guaranteed elsewhere.
Yeah, I think this one's true. It's no secret that I record some of these shows on a macOS system, and that's been getting worse and worse over the last few years, in my opinion. Like, the system settings is completely impenetrable. There's a whole bunch of random app crashes and things that I get now that I didn't used to get. And much the same with Windows. I think it peaked probably 10 or so years ago, and it's been on a downward trajectory since then. I mean, just installing Windows 11 is a real nightmare. Like, bypassing the requirements for a Microsoft account and things like that can be a real pain. And I'm not sure that it really benefits the end user in any way, other than to say, yeah, we did this new thing. Look at this great feature we introduced that everyone definitely wanted.
Well, Frank Strata said longevity. Open source software tends to work just fine for longer periods of time. And that's kind of tied in as well. You look at proprietary software and it just gets abandoned and you're forced to upgrade to this new version. Whereas, again, XFCE, perfect example, it's not massively changed since I started using Linux in 2008, 2009.
Yeah, I think this one is both a benefit and a disadvantage because it tends to mean that people get angry when someone moves their cheese, which does inhibit progress in some ways. Like if you think about Wayland and how long that's been coming down the pipe, and we're only just getting to a point where people are starting to accept it, dare I say.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of stuff like that where just because something is technically better, it doesn't necessarily mean it gets adopted. And that is a challenge. But like you say, if it's investing time in learning something like XFCE or GIMP or the UI behind LibreOffice, that kind of thing is going to stick around. And you're not going to have to relearn those things particularly often at all.
Well, it's a real shame that Phelim isn't here because Curtis said, I wrote an iPhone app that I wanted. I used Xcode and Swift, Apple's approved tools for doing so. I installed the app only on my phone. Because I never paid for the developer account, I have to reinstall that app on my phone every week. That's right. I have to pay to freely use code that I wrote and use on a phone that I own. If you're curious, the code is, of course, open source with an MIT license. And then Curtis links to that, and it is ChatGPT shopping. So it's a ChatGPT-based shopping list. But that really does just... that must be infuriating.
I totally agree with this. I think we've brought it up a couple of times in this podcast. It's requiring a paid £100 a year developer account to be able to publish your own apps on your own devices. I don't understand. And this is exactly the reason why I got into open source, which I think I've said in other places. And it was like, I used to enjoy doing a bit of development, and I used Visual Studio 97, and I wanted to share the code, and I just couldn't easily share the code in any meaningful way. And that's what directly led me to doing stuff on Linux. So really, I'm kind of glad that Apple still makes these decisions, because Linux is still the best option.
Well, like I said, we got loads of replies to this one. So I'll put a link in the show notes. You can read through them all. There's some really good ones there. And do follow us on Mastodon for future questions. Okay, this episode is sponsored by people who support us with PayPal and Patreon. Go to latenightlinux.com/support for details of how you can support us too. For $10 a month on Patreon, you can get access to an RSS feed that contains all the Late Night Linux family shows without adverts like this. There's also an option to get just this show ad-free for $5 a month. Some episodes are even released a day or so early for Patreon supporters. So if you like what we do and can afford it, it'd be great if you could support us at latenightlinux.com/support. On to a bit of admin then. First of all, thank you everyone who supports us with PayPal and Patreon. We really do appreciate that. If you want to join those people, you can go to latenightlinux.com/support. And remember that for various amounts on Patreon, you can get an advert-free RSS feed of either this show or all the shows in the Late Night Linux family. And you even get some episodes early. And if you want to get in contact with us, you can email show@latenightlinux.com. Let's do some discoveries then. Gary, PyKVM has made you stop hoarding old ThinkPads. What?
Yeah, well, that might be a little bit of a premature statement that I put in the doc. But I have laying around another one of the infamous Wise 5070s, and I was trying to find something to do with it. And what I realized was that sometimes it's really nice to have a physical machine to go and test a distro on, or go and play with a new piece of software on. And I'd kept a stack of old laptops around for this for the longest time, and they're taking up space. And I was moving office room at home recently, and the box of laptops has gotten really heavy all of a sudden. So I had this Wise 5070 laying around, and I thought there must be some kind of way that I can have keyboard, video, mouse access over the network without buying some super expensive piece of kit from Dell or HP or whatever it is. And like most people, I've got random Raspberry Pis laying around in a drawer, and it turns out that PyKVM is a product that you can buy, stick a Raspberry Pi into the case, and it has a video capture card in. It uses GPIO to break out the front panel headers from a motherboard into an RJ45 jack, so you can control the on-off for the PC. And you effectively get an IPMI style interface for any PC over the network. So it's really great. So now what I have is the Wise 5070 in the garage, the PyKVM plugged into it and always turned on, and I just hit the IP of the PyKVM, and I've got full access from the BIOS all the way up to in an OS on the machine.
We must have talked about this before.
Well, I checked, and I don't think that you have. So I thought I would throw it in and claim it, because it's super, super useful for if you've got a home server in a cupboard somewhere, or my use case for testing distros. And it's probably the best 80 quid I've spent on Amazon recently.
Because we talked about Barrier before. Was that you, Graham?
Yeah, I've done a Google for it, and 2.5 Admins 157 mentions it. So maybe you're thinking of that.
That's why I'm thinking of that. But we've not mentioned it on this show, so that's fine.
No. But it looks wonderful. I have to. My Wise terminal is underneath the kitchen counter, and actually I have to pull off the side of the kitchen cabinets to be able to get to it. So I'd really love something like this.
Yeah, it's really useful.
Is it possible to hook more than one machine to the power on and off GPIOs? I appreciate you can only have one video in at a time, but could you turn on and off other bits and pieces with it the rest of the time?
I think natively it only supports one, but I can't imagine it would be particularly difficult to repurpose some of the other GPIO pins on the Pi to do it. It just natively in the software only supports the standard power reset, hard disk, and power LED on the machine to pass through. And as for controlling multiple machines, there's no reason that you can't stick an actual KVM switch on the other side of the Pi KVM. I've seen people do that as well. So then they just hit the control left or whatever it is to switch between machines on your actual KVM.
Nice.
To then use the video mouse part.
Will, Kitty.
Kitty is yet another terminal emulator for Linux. It's open source. It also happens to be cross-platform. It seems to be written in a combination of Python and a bit of C in there on the back end, I think. The selling point on this is that it offloads as much as it can into, OpenGL, so onto your graphics card. And so it should be quite quick and should feel very snappy.
Why do I need a graphics card for my terminal?
Well, you don't need one, right? But if you want colors and you want to be able to scroll up and down, for example, if you've got a 1,000-line scroll back and you want to scroll really quickly, then having all of that in the GPU is slightly beneficial if you squint. So I was told about this from a friend at work. I installed it easy enough, got it up and running, and played with it a little while. And I thought, this is fun. This is pretty good. Got a little bit bored after about 10, 15 minutes. I think the reality is there's going to have to be something quite incredible about a terminal emulator to make me want to switch from whatever it is that comes with the computer or whatever distro I'm using to something special. And on reflection, I don't think it was this, but maybe it's for some other people. The fact that it's relatively new, it's relatively fresh, I think is worth checking out. But yeah, I didn't stick with it, I'm afraid, but it was interesting nonetheless.
I'm just not convinced that I need a terminal other than whatever the default one is. XFCE 4 terminal, whatever it's called, is just fine.
Yeah, it turns out I agree.
Yeah, I agree. The only other terminal I use is the drop-down terminal Quake, so I can just hit tilde and type something in quickly.
Yeah, I use Yaquake for the same thing. But I have used Kitty, and I like the idea that it's kind of putting pressure on some of the terminal managers to consider acceleration, because it is really fast, as you say, in the scroll back. And there's a noticeable kind of latency improvement on input, which can be important. So maybe some of those features will make it into something like console.
It just feels like if you need a GPU, you're using your terminal wrong to me.
But if you've got a GPU and you're not using it for anything else, why not use it a little bit?
I suppose. Graham, Pro 54.
Yeah, so I haven't got any sound demos, but this is a synthesizer that plays in a browser. But there's more to it than this. It's obviously open source. It's written in an audio-specific language called C major, which itself looks interesting. I might talk about that in a bit. It's a recreation of a software synthesizer that was released in 2002 by Native Instruments called Pro 53. And it has the blessing of Native Instruments. And it's been written by Julian Storer, who created the C major language, but also created Juice and the Traction DAW. So it's a really high quality, amazing sound. And this, I know I'm going to get faded out in the reverb now. But the Pro 54 and the Pro 53, they emulate a Prophet 5 synthesizer, which was from 1978, and an incredible, perhaps one of the most important synths of all time. A polyphonic synth came after the Yamaha CS80, but with digital programming, so you could save patches for the first time. It was one of the first synths to get MIDI. It became a complete classic. It was originally designed by Dave Smith, who was one of the people who created the MIDI spec. It's used on so many tracks, things like New Order's Blue Monday Bass, This Must Be the Place by Talking Heads. Japan used it a lot. Ryuichi Sakamoto used it a lot, I think. Anyway, it's an amazing sounding synth. Nothing else sounds like it. And being able to access it in a web browser, considering this is the cutting edge of DSP in 2002, is pretty amazing. And there's the code behind it. I think it should lead to plugins using the same code. On Linux, at least, it's one of the few kind of real virtual synths that you can find, and it's free and open source and of a very high quality. And if you want to learn about synthesis, this is a real synth with kind of classic pop chops behind it that you can learn your craft on.
So when I opened this, it wanted access to my microphone. If I had a MIDI controller connected, would it ask for access to that? And could I play it with a proper keyboard?
It's not obvious to me that you can. It does have the capability of having MIDI input, but I can't test it just now. But you can use the QWERTY keyboard, at least for playing the keys, which is the best way anyway.
Oh, right, yeah, cool. Because I've just been clicking on the keys while you were talking, thinking, I really hope your recording doesn't fuck up and I have to go to the backup because it's going to have me just playing random notes on it. This is very cool and does seem familiar to me. I might have used that Native Instruments one at some point.
Yeah, it really was a great synth. The original is also a great synth. So the user interface of this virtual instrument in a browser is exactly the same as the hardware synth. You can still buy it. They recreated the original circuitry in a modern version of it, and it's, £3,000. This is exactly the same thing with all the same kind of sounds.
For free in your browser?
Yeah.
Well, I've discovered that the Arch Wiki knows all. Okay, well, I already knew that. But it continues to be just the fountain of all Linux knowledge, seemingly, because I had a laptop where I wanted to swap 3-finger tap and 2-finger tap, because I like 2 fingers to be middle click for opening and closing tabs in the browser, and 3 fingers to be right click, which seemingly makes me weird. No one else does that. And normally I use sync client. I don't know how to say that. I've never had to say it out loud before. And just change tap button 2 = 2 and 3 = 3. And that just didn't work. And so I went crying to the Linux After Dark Telegram group where I knew that Chris would solve it for me. And sure enough, after about 10 minutes, he linked me to the Arch Wiki, and there was the solution, and rebooted, and it just worked. I had to turn the acceleration back up after I'd done this, but it was just editing the exorc.conf, obviously. But just once again, the Arch Wiki, it's almost, well, it's beyond a meme, isn't it, that the Arch Wiki has all the answers, but it really does.
Yeah, whenever I'm Googling for something obscure, and, I ask the people that I know and can't get a straight answer, you Google it, usually the answer that is correct comes from the Arch Wiki. It is a fantastic resource, and I'm grateful for it often.
Yeah, even if you don't use Arch, you'd think like, oh, well, it's only going to be good for Arch. Well, no, it's good for all of Linux, pretty much. Right, well, we better get out of here then. I forgot to thank you for joining us, Gary, last time.
You're more than welcome.
Yeah, it's been great having you. We'll be back next week when it'll probably be news, and Phelan will probably be back. But until then, I've been Joe.
I've been Graham.
I've been Gary.
And I've been Will.
See you later.